Welcome, everybody. Uh, so glad you could join us today for this Emerging Scholars Network. Happy Valentine's Day, by the way, and also have a blessed Ash Wednesday for those of you who observe that as well. Interesting convergence of days, but glad you could take your time to join us today. Well, my name is Bob Truby. I serve as the National Director of the Emerging Scholars Network, which is a ministry that's equipping and encouraging developing scholars who follow Jesus together. Many of us have seen a number of the different challenges that have been facing, particularly the evangelical church today. We've seen abuse scandals. We've seen problems with leadership. And our guest today actually is both one who has narrated the story of a leadership crisis and toxic leadership in the church, but also has actually come out of and experienced that in his own life and experienced some of the disillusionment that comes when you go through something like that personally, and has written about that journey and his journey into recovery. And so I'm very excited that we're going to be talking with Mike Cosper today. Just a note, we are recording the conversation, and if you would prefer not to be recorded or photographed at any point in the conversation, leave your mic muted and disable your video. If you continue with either of those on, you consent to allow InterVarsity to use the recording and any screenshots of our conversation for InterVarsity ministry purposes. I'm going to stop recording momentarily so that you can adjust your video and audio if you need to. And while we do that, I'll share just a few housekeeping. And Mike, who you see here, is a writer and podcaster for Christians in a post-Christian world. He's the director of podcasting for Christianity Today, where he hosts The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill and Cultivated, a podcast about faith and work. Mike also served as one of the founding pastors at Sojourn Church in Louisville, Kentucky, from which he launched Sojourn Music, a collective of musicians writing songs for the church. He's the author of Recapturing the Wonder, Faith Among the Faithless, The Stories We Tell, and Rhythms of Grace. And he lives in Louisville, Kentucky, with his wife Sarah and his two daughters. So, Mike, we're so glad you could join us today.
I'm really honored to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Well, and the book we're talking about today, Land of My Sojourn, is launching just within the next few weeks. Is that right?
Yeah, I think 2 weeks from yesterday it should be out.
All right, yeah, and I think there are copies already available if you go to the press, and we're going to tell you how to get those later on. Well, we're going to be talking today, as I mentioned, about Mike's new book, Land of My Sojourn: The Landscape of a Faith Lost and Found. And I wondered if you might start just by giving us a little bit of the backstory of the faith lost part of this book.
Yeah, it's funny that this is the second conversation I've had about the book, sort of in advance of the release in publicly, and both times now that's the first question: what do you mean by faith lost? And I think what I mean by faith lost is not that I abandoned my faith or sort of lost faith in that sort of flat two-dimensional sense, but that I certainly lost a version of my faith. I lost faith as I understood it. One of the metaphors I use early on in the book is that there were several of these sort of jarring encounters over a period of a couple of years where it felt like just randomly someone flipped a switch and gravity turned off, and that I just sort of found myself floating in space, so to speak. That's what I mean by lost, the sense that I was lost, the sense that I couldn't make head or tails of faith as I knew it, community as I knew it, church as I knew it. I couldn't make sense of my own calling because I'd had such a clear and strong sense of, this is my faith, this is my calling, this is what I'm going to be doing for the rest of my life. And in a period of 18, 24 months, it all kind of got turned upside down.
Yeah, it's like the whole landscape shifted.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so for me, it was, the book is really about this journey of in some ways, midlife is maybe not quite the right word, but I think a lot of people have experiences like it at midlife where whether it's through encounters with suffering or loss or grief, whatever the case might be, you just sort of wake up one day and go, man, I have to sort of re-examine everything. And, for me, I saw, I've seen a lot of people over the years. There's a lot of conversation around deconstruction and it's sort of the whole ex-evangelical
Hmm.
thing, people leaving their faith. For me, that wasn't the outcome. The outcome was sort of rediscovering a first love in a lot of ways, um, but also letting a certain kind of and not letting, I mean, the death of a certain kind of idealism that was in me, not just sort of out, not just a problem that was sort of out beyond me, but it was a problem that was in me that had to die as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, at the beginning of your book, you write about the high ideals and inspiring vision that nourished the beginnings of Sojourn. You
Hmm.
kind of compared it to Jesus and the disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration. And, can't we just stay here?
Hmm.
And I wondered what happened to this close group of dedicated leaders that led to this turn to a very toxic leadership culture.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, how long do we have to talk about it?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer to this, and I think this is the the tendency of the church right now, there's a lot of these stories. The sort of easy answer to this stuff is to say, well, the problem is narcissistic leaders. The problem is the
Mhm.
culture of celebrity. The problem is this one thing or that one thing. Um, I had this really funny day when I was producing The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. I had this really funny day where I interviewed two different Christian leaders, and this was kind of towards the end of the series. And I was just gathering. I was trying to get some audio clips of some sort of Christian thought leader types to say like, so where do we go from here? What does the church need? And the first person I talked to was a Baptist, like a very serious Reformed Baptist type. And he said, well, obviously the problem here is, we need congregationalism. We need the congregations to be in charge and holding their leaders accountable and, kind of gives me like a clear and pristine Baptist polity. And then the next person I talked to was an Anglican. And she said, well, I mean, obviously the thing we need is sacramentalism and we need the liturgy and we need, we need to decenter the personalities of all this stuff. And I realized, after about the third or fourth of those conversations, every person I talk to who I ask like, where do we go from here, is going to give me their polity and say, this is the way to do it. This is how we figure it out. I say that because I think what corrupts our systems is often very, very complex. And I don't mean that in a way that's sort of dismissive. I mean it in that it's just very, very subversive. It's hard to put your finger on just one thing. Certainly an unhealthy narcissistic leader is a massive factor in all of it. And it was a factor for us. But the other factors in it were like like for a leader like that to have the power that they hold in my church or in any church elsewhere in the world, they have to have leaders around them who hear that grandiose, idealistic, narcissistic vision of we're going to go out there and change the world and go, well, yeah, that's what we're going to do. We're going to go out there and change the world. And when you start telling yourself that grandiose story, it sets the table for a lot of damage, for a lot of dangerous stuff, um, because uh, because suddenly you have a mission that's so important that the importance of the end goal, the importance of starts to eclipse the means. What kind of people are we while we make this journey? What kind of people are we as we do ministry together? And and then that's where again, the ends justify the means, and the means can be abusive and very damaging.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It seems sometimes when the mission becomes all important and how we get there doesn't matter,
Hmm.
you get into real trouble.
Yeah, precisely, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the phrases that just jumped off the page to me, as I was reading the book was where you talked about being one good conversation away from getting things right and making things healthy.
Mhm.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I think a lot of us have probably had a relationship like that of some sort in our lives, whether it was at work or a difficult relationship with a family member or a difficult relationship with a friend or somewhere else along the way where it was always this mix of good and bad, right? And the good's so good you want to make it last.
Yeah.
But the bad's so bad that you also kind of know in the back of your head it's unsustainable. And so you end up with this feeling that, you know, that I believe enough in the good of the situation and of the person that if we could just work on these issues, if we could just sort of resolve certain tensions, then I genuinely think that, on the other side of that conversation, we could actually make progress. And something we saw at Sojourn over the years is that as the church grew, our executive leadership became this kind of rotating cast where pastors would come in, they'd lead for a couple of years, they'd burn out, and then they'd either sort of drift off into other areas of management in the church or they'd leave altogether. And it was a lot of leaving altogether. And uh and I think that was the overwhelming feeling for all of us who served in that role was that there was something like, again, the reason drugs are addictive is they make you feel good, right? Like the
Mhm.
reason narcissistic cultures are powerful and they last for a long time is that when you're a part of them, the experience is powerful and you do feel like you're changing the world. Like when your church has grown from 12 people to 3,500 people meeting in 4 locations across the city, you look at that and you go, well, we've done something here. Like this is incredible. Why would I want this to end? Um, it's easy in hindsight to look at it and just see the negative and see the people who were hurt, see your own scars and wounds and kind of read it all through that. But but I think like part of the reason why I think that phrase was so important to include in the book is because it helps me to remember what it was actually like being inside it. It was good enough that we thought, man, if we could just resolve one or two little things, everything else will be okay.
Hmm. And yet that conversation never happened. Can you say anything about why?
No, the conversation happened. It just happened
Okay.
over and over and over again.
Okay.
The change didn't happen, right?
Yeah.
Because so the conversations happened all the time. Like you would have these very intense conversations, and again, I think this is very common in churches like this. You'd have these conversations where you'd say, "We've got real problems here. We need to address some of these things." And the leader or the leaders involved would get together and say, yeah, let's own our sin, let's repent, let's be in it together, let's move things forward. And and then the pattern would begin to repeat itself within
Mhm.
a fairly short amount of time.
Were there parallels that you saw between the culture in your own congregation and what you saw as you chronicled the story of Mars Hill?
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there and there were differences, significant differences as well. I mean, everybody's got their own circumstances and their own besetting sins and all of that. But I think that our churches were planted around the same time, so they kind of came out of the same historic moment and the same sort of cultural stew of what was going on at the time. Very clearly, I mean, you can look back and you can see it in almost every denomination, um, that between sort of the mid 1990s and the mid late 2000s, there was a real church planting boom, like a very successful church
Yeah.
planting boom in the United States. And what's interesting is that a lot of the churches that were planted in that window have sustained at a rate that was disproportionate for what's been planted since and what was planted before. Like something happened then. Like the the US was ready for new churches at the time and embraced them. Um, and so so I think being part of the same movement definitely meant that, as someone who was an insider in my own community, I could recognize some things inside Mars Hill uniquely. I think it gave me a different set of eyes in terms of the questions I was asking when I came to tell that story. Because part of what I felt like was important for the podcast in particular was to give people a glimpse inside the room where the leaders were making decisions, and where, because a lot of times again, sort of, you look back and you go, how could this have happened? How come no one ever held him accountable? How come no one was ever, what happened to all those, what happened to all of the enablers? What happened to all of the people who benefited from the success of that ministry? What does accountability look like for them? And I think part of what made Mars Hill so engaging was, once you started to peek behind the curtain, you realized, oh, behind the curtain in that room, there's a lot of really wounded people there too. The damage was all the way from the top down in terms of how unhealthy it actually, the system actually was. And uh, so again, yeah, I think that in particular was probably a perspective that I brought into the production of the podcast that was just, again, from my own experience more than anything else.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And and it raises this question of who pastors the pastors,
Hmm.
who cares for the wounded, those wounded.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And do, ultimately, I mean, I think this was true of the leader in my church. I think it was true of Mark. Um, I had a wise friend one time say, healthy, sustainable leaders are men and women who can go to the people who are closest to them, not their best friends and biggest cheerleaders, but the people who are actually closest to them on a daily basis, and say, tell me what it's like to be with me, to work with me, and
Mm,
to just listen and believe what you're told. Um, and he's my friend who told me this, he goes, the last part's the hard part. Everybody loves to hear about themselves. The hard part is to hear it and to believe that what they're saying is true. And instead of going, well, let me justify why I treat you the way I do, or why you experience me the way that you
yeah.
do, um, let me be curious about, well, why am I projecting into their reality that way? Why am I causing that kind of stress or frustration or pain? And begin to do that self-examination. Um, that's the hard part that sort of never happens in these unhealthy organizations, because what you get instead is, I'm the leader who's responsible for all of the success, so the organization needs to attenuate to my dysfunction, so that I can keep doing the great things that I'm doing for God.
Mm. You went from your experience, actually leaving Sojourn wasn't actually where you hit bottom, it seems like. You actually went from there to kind of do a startup media company, and then in the midst of the 2016 elections, uh, you had a lot of your funding pulled by followers of the former president, uh, because of a few remarks you made that you thought were just pretty consistent with scripture and so forth. And I, one of the things I've wondered about is whether you saw any connection between some of the leadership abuses that you write about and
Mhm.
the turn of churches toward Christian nationalism. Is there a
Mm.
connection?
It's a great question. I don't know. And the reason I say that is that I actually think that, you know, I think that a lot of the spiritually abusive behavior and the narcissistic abusive behavior that we see in the church, you see in a lot of different organizations in the world. You see them inside big,
Hmm.
explosive growing entrepreneurial organizations. You see them in academia, you see them in politics, and you see it
Yeah.
across the spectrum. Um, so I mean, I'm extremely critical of the turn towards Christian nationalism, for sure, unreservedly critical uh, of that turn. Um, but the extent to which it's a product of the, or it's related to or correlated to the the leadership issues in the church, I have to just continually kind of go, I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly how it matches up. It matches up in a kind of essence around the types of leaders that we rally around.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, as somebody who's followed politics pretty closely for the last 5 or 6 years, um, my sense is that behind closed doors, most of our big, prominent national political leaders are, you know, pretty rough people to work for, right? That you don't arrive to national prominence for being universally loved, and the ones that you hear great things about, are the ones that are retiring right and left after short tenures in the
Yeah.
Senate. So
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, After you left the leadership role at Sojourn and had your funding pooled with this company, you experienced a transforming time while you were traveling in Israel.
mhm.
And I wonder if you might share a little bit of what happened there that began a process of restoration for you.
Yeah, I'd been to Israel before, and I went on a trip. I'd gathered together a group of some friends, some writers, some artists, poets, uh, various people, just for kind of I think we were there about 2 weeks, and we were in Israel, we were in the West Bank, we were kind of all over the land there, and the idea was just to immerse with people, people across the ideological spectrum, um, and maybe about half our time was spent with people, and about half our time was spent at sort of interesting historic sites or just modern sites
Mhm.
in these places, modern communities inside both Israel and the West Bank. Um, so all that to say, there was this day where in particular, there was this day where we went to Mount Precipice, which is near Nazareth, and it's a famous scene in the Bible where Jesus comes out at the synagogue, and he reads from the book of Isaiah, and he says, I tell you, uh, on this day, this text has been fulfilled. And people kind of go nuts, and they drag him to outside of town. They're going to throw him off the edge of the cliff, and they believe this would have been the cliff that he was thrown off of. Um, and he, sort of miraculously slips away. So we're standing on Mount Precipice, and we're talking about this story. And I look over to my left, and there's this otherworldly looking sort of dome shaped rock that just sits out on top of the plain. And I was like, well, what is that? Because that thing just literally looks like it came down from another planet and landed. And they said, oh, that's Mount Tabor. That's historically recognized as the Mount of Transfiguration. And the tour guide that was with us, who traveled with us for the couple weeks, starts telling me some of the history of the thing and the monasteries that are on there and everything. And so that image, for whatever reason, the image of that mountain just stuck with me, long after the trip. And there were
Mm.
several other experiences while we were there that were, also stuck with me, but that one in particular. And then one day when the company shut down, I left ministry and was in this kind of low season, and a friend of mine who had been mentoring me, or has been my mentor since I was like 16, had told me, just read through the Gospels, like go easy on your soul, and just spend some time with the Gospels. And I ended up one day uh, reading the story of the Transfiguration, and I saw that mountain in my head, and I reconnected with that story in a way that I never had before, because what I found myself connecting with that time is that, like Peter's a great punching bag for preachers because he sort of responds wrong to everything.
Yeah.
And as I read it that day, what struck me was, actually, I think Peter's reacting the way all of us would react, which is, here you are, you've spent your whole life listening to the story of Elijah, listening to the story of Moses. You've been following Jesus for a couple of years now. You've got this hope that he's them. He's the return of this figure that's gonna bring to your day freedom from empire and everything else that you've been dreaming of since you were a kid. And so there's this incredible moment where you see his glory and you see these childhood heroes manifest next to him, and his response is, he says, Lord, do you want me to build tents? Do you want me to build? The King James calls it tabernacles. I love that, tabernacle, because it implies this sort of um, it implies that he recognizes the holiness of the moment, which I think he did. And as I read at that time, it dawned on me, like, what he's actually saying is, oh man, how do we make this last? Right? Like, this
Mm.
is beautiful, and and this is everything I've ever hoped for. And it's happening right in front of my eyes. What can I do to make it last? I don't want to leave the mountain. Can we build tents? Can we just stay here? And and of course, basically as soon as he asks, the moment's over. And then as they walk down the mountain, shortly after that, Jesus predicts his death again, and they encounter a child who was demon possessed and had been throwing his own body into a fire for his entire life. So you see this child whose body was just scarred and mangled. Anyway, all that to say that what I connected with all of a sudden was the idealism of that moment, and and I connected with it recognizing, like, I know exactly what that feels like, because where I was then was I was looking back on the moments of my life that were beautiful like that and going, how do I recreate them? Like, how do I make it work again? How do I bring the people back together? How do I put the band back together? Like, how do I return to those moments that were so powerful and so meaningful? And of course, what Peter doesn't know is that it's only getting worse from there, because from there's from there is Jerusalem, and from there is the Gethsemane and the cross, and even the empty tomb, which initially is this painful shock, this disorienting shock. Um, and so that began this process of sort of re-narrating my story and thinking about it through that lens of disorientation and disillusionment, and this real sense that, well, maybe actually at the heart of the Christian life, those kinds of disorienting experiences are a normal thing and a good thing. And so yeah, that's kind of that sort of leads to everything else in the book.
Yeah, you end up following Peter and Elijah around to these
Mm-hmm.
different places, as it were, and
Mm-hmm.
and many of the disorienting experiences you talk about, and what was happening in them.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And there was just, again, there was something about that trip in particular with my that was not, I mean, it was guided, but we were kind of in charge of our own guide. My friend Brett Lott was on the trip. He actually has a book where he writes about the trip that's coming out this next summer as well. And Brett called it the magical mystery tour. Like, Brett had been he'd lived in Jerusalem for a few years. He'd been over there a million times. But we all kind of look back on that and acknowledge, like, yeah, there was something fun, something weird happened there for all of us. Like, we all left changed by that trip in various ways. And uh so the book really tries to sort of plant your feet in the land as you're thinking about these stories. And and how transformative they are.
Hey, we need to take a break and let people know about your book, and
Great.
then we'll get into some audience Q&A. So actually, this is your cue, audience participants. So if you have questions you want to ask of Mike, please put them into the chat. So the book we're talking about today is called Land of My Sojourn. Uh, and it can be purchased at University Press at this link, which is in the chat, for 25% off with free shipping using the code IVP ESN at the checkout. And that discount is good through February 20th. And actually, the folks at University Press said that can be applied if you want to order other books on the same order. So that's a pretty good deal. And so I'd invite you to pick up Mike's book and maybe even maybe a couple of Mike's other titles with IVP, or even some other things as well there. So 25% off using the code IVP ESN. And with that, we'll move into some Q&A. And let's see, is anybody, okay, we're still waiting. Okay, we do have a question here. both in the Mars Hill podcast and when you talked about Sojourn, people explained the good of the ministry as increasing numbers. We evangelicals often do that, but should we reconsider that emphasis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's I mean, I think the easy answer to that is yes. Uh, Not that numbers don't matter, right? Like you know, but I've told this story before, so if you've heard it before, I apologize. But um, at one point during at one point after the podcast had come out, I was talking to someone who is the pastor of one of these, 30,000 member type churches. And, he was genuinely wrestling with some of the implications of the podcast. And I've known this person for a while, and this is someone who, by reputation, I think is a pretty healthy leader and a fairly healthy church. And they're constantly wrestling with, resisting the temptations to become a personality cult and the problems of big churches and the benefits of big churches. So anyway, all that to say, he was saying, you know, look, I've been doing this for decades. All I know how to do is to count, who comes on Sunday, who joins, who gives. Like that's what we're taught to do. What am I supposed to do? And as like a half joke, I said, well, what if for a year all you counted was pastoral visits to hospitals and the number of people, the number of members you could get to attend the funerals of either other members or their family members.
Hmm.
Like basically shift your mindset so that what you're counting is how is the church showing up in people's deepest moments of grief and suffering inside the community. Um, and I laughed and I said, you'll never do it, but imagine if you did. Imagine if for a year that was the only thing you counted, and and then you try to sort of assess what is what does the health of the community look like on the other side of that, where we were really focused on grief and suffering. Um, I'd love to see a church take it up. Like I said, I've told that story many times. I'd love to see a church take it up and see what it did to their culture. I think it would be radically transformative.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, that would be interesting. Uh, yeah, I might add even just, how many people visited this, how many people helped support the sick with meals and other things like that.
Yeah, yeah, meals
Yeah,
delivered. Yeah,
yeah, it is really interesting. And oftentimes, it's funny. Many times, uh, these are actually statistics that denominational groups or whatever are at, they're asking for the numbers, the budget numbers, the attendance numbers, the member numbers, things like that. So, we tend to pursue what we measure.
yeah, that's right.
Hey, anyhow, what's been your experience of being in an interdenominational evangelical space like CT after being in the more Calvinist A29 movement?
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, I was uh I still have a lot of friends inside that sort of neo-Calvinist world, and I wrote for the Gospel Coalition for many years before I did anything with CT or got out of that. But I mean, at heart, I've always been kind of a big tent evangelical. Like I think every denomination should have their distinctions and express those fully and all of that. But I also think that, like, the evangelical movement means something because that we do define those core things and share them, and we have a lot to learn from each other as a result of it. Um, so that was actually a fairly easy transition for me. I mean, I just have a lot of respect for CT as an institution before I came because of its history, and then because of some of my colleagues, people that I've gotten to work with at CT, whether it was people like Ted Olson, who's now at IVP, um, who I've admired for years and years, but also Kate Shellnut and Daniel Silliman. It's an easy place to uh, you know it's an easy place to find yourself uh, with just a lot of admiration and respect for your colleagues and their talent.
Hmm. Another question here. Peter, people have critiqued your podcast for not going far enough, meaning not deconstructing evangelicalism far enough.
Mhm.
Some of that might just be those who don't embrace Christianity anymore. But do you feel there are deeper theological and cultural aspects of evangelicalism that have yet to be re-examined?
Mhm.
Uh, and highlights, is there something in the DNA that needs revisiting? Do you link, okay, and we talked about it a little bit, do you link
Mhm.
Driscoll to Trump, for example? And is there more to your podcast to investigate?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I think for sure the answer to that is yes. I think there's a lot for evangelicalism to continue to investigate, um, in terms of why some of these things are happening, and in terms of ideological capture, for the sake of politics. Um, there's a lot of work being done on that. Before we got started, Bob, you were talking about Tim Alberta's book, which is an exploration of some of that, which I think is really well done. I just reviewed, or didn't review, I just interviewed the director and producer of God and Country, this new film on Christian nationalism that is, I would say, is pretty. It's really well. I mean, as a film, it's very well done. Um, as a critique of evangelicalism, it's one of those things where I feel like they needed somebody on the production team that really understood evangelicals a little more to be able to kind of actually speak to them. So there's some real misses, I think, unfortunately. But all that to say that yes, I do think that there's more work to be done. One of my favorite clips that we used on the show was was actually a clip from John MacArthur
Hmm.
in 2016 saying that the embrace of Mark Driscoll is what laid the groundwork for the embrace of Donald Trump by the GOP. And for those who don't know the history, MacArthur and Driscoll really don't like each other, like deeply dislike one another, and had publicly feuded throughout Mark's ministry over the years. And Mark kind of trolled MacArthur, um, and MacArthur lit him up a number of times in some articles and that sort of thing. So that was not said out of affection for Trump. That was said out of contempt for Trump. And then, of course, what the great irony is that by 2020, MacArthur had endorsed Trump for the 2020 election. Um, so how that happens, like you could just take that one little story right there and go, so how does MacArthur go from saying the Trump represents this guy who I think is everything that's wrong with evangelicalism to I'm endorsing Trump in 2020? That I think is particularly interesting. In fact, I'd be very interested in spending some time, and I may end up doing that this year, spending some time just looking at the folks who, like MacArthur, like Albert Mohler, were never Trump in 2016 and then endorsed Trump in 2020, and by all appearances are going to probably endorse him again this year as well. Um, there was another question that you asked, the theological piece. That's one of those things where it's kind of like back to the question when you'd asked the question earlier. Like, I think it's way too easy to say um, theology is a convenient scapegoat for abuses, right?
Hmm.
To say that theology drives abuse. I'm not saying theology doesn't drive abuse. To be clear, there there are theologies that are certainly that are built around an understanding of authority that's enabling of abuse in ways that others aren't. One of the reasons why we didn't go there in the podcast, though, and one of the reasons why I'm often hesitant to sort of dive too directly at it, is that it's too easy to find examples of people where the theology was quote unquote right, or the theology was progressive, right, and the abuses were disgusting. I mean, the Hybels story is a perfect example. Hybels was the champion of mainstream evangelical complementarian or egalitarianism, and what was going on behind closed doors was totally contemptible. Um, And so again, it's not to say that there aren't explorations to do there. I think there's a sense in which some of those are are often secondary factors for something deeper that's going on that drives narcissistic abuse and spiritual abuse and sexual abuse inside the church.
Fair enough. Okay. We have another question that I think actually maybe follows in some ways from this. Um, and Steve asks, one of the themes that struck me in the Mars Hill podcast was the way Driscoll and others related to women in the church and broader society. It seems to me that gender was one of the central factors in the toxicity of leadership. What are your thoughts about how much Driscoll's problem centered on his treatment of women, views of masculinity, etc.? What can be learned from this and corrected in the church moving forward?
A great question. So actually, it's funny. I have a book coming at the end of this year called "The Church in Dark Times" that looks at this pretty directly. Because what I think actually is interesting about Driscoll's approach to masculinity is that it's more ideological than theological.
Hmm.
So Driscoll has this idea at the very beginning of the life of Mars Hill where he says, 99% of the world's problems are the fault of young men, and 99% of the problems in the church are because of men failing to lead, right? And so what lies underneath that is really kind of and I don't mean this as a scare word, I mean it as a kind of literal word, like a kind of totalitarian ideology that says if we just get masculinity right, everything else is going to work out, right? If Christian men can be real, quote unquote, real men, which in Mars Hill meant they kind of looked like Mark, right? Like they were into what Mark was into, and everything sort of catered to his idealized vision of his own life. If we can get that right, then marriages are going to be better, and children are going to grow up to be Christians, and their businesses are going to thrive, and we're going to, and he would use like totalitarian language. He would use this language of we're going to take over the city, we're going to own this place, we're going to own, and then you start to get to the even more grandiose vision of this was something we didn't have time to really delve into in the podcast, but in that last year and a half, 2 years of the church, they had a roadmap to 100,000 locations worldwide, and more than 1 million people in the church was kind of the long-term goal. Wild stuff, right? And he truly genuinely believed that it was going to happen, and the only way you can get to doing that is to really believe that you've nailed something down so perfectly that if you get that right, everything else kind of comes together for it. And and what's interesting is you look at the life of the people who were involved in the church. You have a lot of the leaders in the church came as young men with deep father wounds who were attracted to this vision and who were attracted to this idea that the root of which was actually you're not going to be the slacker, loser, abandoner father you had. Not only that, you're going to be able to change the world for Jesus. And if you start to if you like just imagine the loyalty that buys from young men, and the level of commitment they will give to a movement like that says you can heal this father wound in your heart in this community. It's an incredibly powerful thing. And here's the thing, it's like, and it's got that grain of gospel truth at the heart of it, which is that God is a perfect father who can heal our father wounds, who can lead men to become what he intended for them as their maker. So I think Driscoll had a way of capitalizing on that certainly, that certainly was the driving engine of that church. What's interesting then is to sort of take that and go, well, how does that express itself in other places? And just to go to Hybels, because Hybels is another one that I've done a lot of the looking at. For Hybels, it was couched in the language of like leadership, right? Everything was about leadership.
Mm-hmm.
The reason men don't want to go to church is because there's no real leaders in the church. The reason the suburbs don't go to church is because the suburbs, they're about success. They're about, and so everywhere he walked in the room, like the second he had a chance to get on the microphone, he'd tell you he was a businessman. He was an entrepreneur. Like that was his identity. And it was the same kind of idealistic projection that was not so much follow me as I follow Christ, but follow Bill because Bill's a leader's leader. And he could be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, but he gave all that up in order to run the church. Like those stories you just hear over and over and over and over again inside these communities. And when you recognize them as ideological, that what they're offering through that story is this sort of utopian future and purpose. You realize the incredible motivating power and why people could give so much and sacrifice so much for those communities, and also why they ultimately fell apart because they didn't have roots. I mean, the nature of ideology is that it's about movement. It's not about roots. It's why our institutions are falling apart. So, the long answer to your question, but that's part 2. So that's November. Pre-order now at Amazon.com.
Well, one of the things I wonder as you're talking, and I also wonder if there's just idolatry in it, and
Yeah.
that we really are believing in other gods. I'm struck. I think it was something that Russell Moore talked about how a lot of young people are leaving the church not because they don't believe what the church is preaching, but that they don't think the church believes what it's preaching.
Yeah.
Or at least
Yeah.
it confesses, and just that we're trusting, we've turned to other idols, and I
Yeah. I
wonder
mean,
what
my
kind of
favorite,
things are idols.
my favorite quote that from Russ is he made a passing comment one time in a sermon about, we've lost our Christians in public have lost their willingness to turn the other cheek. And one of the pastors of this church came up to him afterwards and said, it's really time. I mean, given what's going on in the world, it's really time for Christians to give up all this namby-pamby, turn the other cheek stuff. It's like, you know where that comes from, right, dude? Like, this is not
Yeah,
not
Jesus
like
said that.
yeah.
Yeah, what does Jesus know? No,
Yeah, exactly.
there it is. Um, hey, we're kind of at the point where we actually need to kind of start wrapping up here. And Mike, I think one of the things I asked you to do was to kind of give us the last word or give us your
Mhm.
final parting shot. So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, interesting. A question came in that actually speaks to this, and so I'm glad, Kellen, your question about like are there elements that are working, and I would say this is true of mega churches as well. Like the healthiest communities that I have seen are communities that value deep friendship and look for ways to sustain deep friendships over time. And if you end up reading the book, and I hope you do, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope it's encouraging. Um, if you end up reading the book, I mean, the book really ends on a chapter that kind of unintentionally is a chapter about friendship and about the way uh, certain friendships were really critical in my own kind of spiritual homecoming from a sense of being lost.
hmm.
Um, and it came because it happened because my wife and I reached a breaking point one night. We heard another horror story. We had someone I'd mentored in ministry for a long time, went through a moral failure, and we just kind of collapsed on the couch one night. And Sarah goes, "We need help. We need to talk to somebody." And we didn't know who to call. We were so lonely. We'd felt so isolated for so long that we just took the risk of reaching out to some people we really hadn't connected with in a long, long season and said, "Hey, we're really hurting right now. Could you all just come over and listen to us for a little while?" And that sparked, a sort of restored friendship with them and a reconciliation with them. And through that kind of a restoration to community, a restoration to a lot of our friendships, and to learning how to talk through our story, and to really hearing, one of the things that was critical was just hearing that, like, oh, we're not alone. Like, other people have walked through all of this with a lot of pain as well. And so I think that, when I hear stories of people going through disillusionment and deconstruction, my heart always breaks. And I think that the thing I always want to tell somebody when they say this to me is I want to say, you've got to find a Christian you can trust who will just sit and listen with you. Because you don't want, on the one hand, you don't, the impulse sometimes is to go find somebody who can fix me. You don't need somebody who can fix you. You need somebody like Job's friends, before they started talking. You need the people who'll just come sit on the ashes with you. And on the other hand, the other temptation is to go find somebody who's going to share your cynicism, and that's the primary thing that you share. Find somebody else who's wounded and cynical about the church and will indulge your rage. And that can be poisonous too. And that's the greatest temptation, I think, for people who are going through a season of grief, is to find somebody to sort of commiserate and rage with, without pressing down into learning to just grieve and to listen to one another. So ultimately, to me, I think, if you've been through painful seasons, the thing we actually need is friends. And friendship takes risk. It takes sticking your neck out. And sometimes it takes literally, because again, it did for us, it takes literally sticking your neck out and saying, we need friends. And that was God's, that was God's grace to us in ways that I can't even begin to describe, and has continued to be for years to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. You actually answered a question I didn't get a chance to ask, which I think was a great note for us to finish on here. Hey, one more time, we're going to let people know how they can get your book, in case they've joined us after the last. The book we've been talking about today is called Land of My Sojourn, by Mike Cosper, which is available at InterVarsity Press, and the link for this is in the chat. You can order it for 25% off with free shipping using the code IVPESN at checkout. And that discount's good through February 20th. And you can actually apply that to any other books you order in that same order as well. So that sounds like a good deal, and I encourage you to take advantage of it. We want to let you know about our next conversation. Our next conversation is actually with a colleague of mine, Rick Mattson. He's written a book. For many on this call, you work in the university setting and struggle with this question of how to, particularly if you're a graduate student or faculty person, where you're actually part of the institution, how do you actually live as a person of faith and actually make your faith known in the academy? And Rick talks about the feelings of risk, the feelings of being daunted, and offers some perspective that is rooted around the idea of God's prior work that goes before us. And he's going to be talking about that and some of the practical things that he has helped grad students and faculty do that are in his new book, Witness in the Academy. And we're going to do that as an evening thing, particularly so that if we have graduate student groups or others who want to join us, they can join us. It'll be at 8 o'clock Eastern time. And the link to register for that conversation is tinyurl/ESN witness. And that link is also in the chat. So finally, as we wrap up, I want to just thank everybody for joining us today. Mike, especially thank you for your generosity of time and for writing this book, which I think is a very important account for many who might share your experiences of being kind of in the wilderness of disillusionment. I want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank InterVarsity Press for their assistance in arranging many of these conversations. And they've just been a great partner with us, not only in offering great discounts on their books, but in supporting our work in doing these ESN conversations. The conversation's been brought to you by the Emerging Scholars Network. If what we're doing sounds interesting to you, you can join us for free at blog.emergingscholars.org. Also, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or that thing that used to be known as Twitter that's now X. And just point to at ESN IVCF and you'll find us there. Also, this video will be on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/ESNIVCF. And if you have friends who said, boy, that sounds like a great conversation, but I couldn't make it today, you might point them there and encourage them to view the conversation on our YouTube channel. So with that, we want to thank everybody, and we'll be ending our recording here, and we'll keep the connection open for a couple minutes if anybody wants to chat or raise any other questions.